A little while back we covered 7 extremely expensive JRPGs, and using CIB once again or complete inbox prices, here are 7 more. Starting with Yokai Watch 3 on 3DS. I lived in Japan back in 2017, a time when Yokai Watch was still very popular, if not beginning to show signs of fatigue. You couldn't go around any street corner without seeing some sort of paraphernalia linked to this series, and once upon a time it was touted as the successor to Pokemon. And the comparisons made sense. Yokai Watch was a creature collector in the same vein as Nintendo's Juggernaut, but decidedly smaller scale in terms of its narrative premise. It was designed as a modern-day Doraemon by founder of Level 5 Akihiro Hino, who had engineered a situation whereby it became a household name following the releases of its anime and second game. Nowadays though, Yokai Watch has been completely overshadowed, mostly in part due to the 2016 release of Pokemon Go, which ate heavily into its market share when it was at the peak of its popularity. And with Yokai Watch 4 effectively in purgatory for localization, it only leaves a few mainline titles for Western players to get stuck into. And if we're talking about Yokai Watch 3, that's easier said than done. Initially it was a GameStop exclusive, at least in America, and they were only willing to ship in very limited quantities, with some outlets bringing in less than 5 at a time. Then consider that the digital version ate up copious amounts of storage space, and that only made physical versions more sought after. Finally, it came out right near the end of the 3DS's life cycle, which has only inflated further following the eShop closing down. All these factors together have pushed Yokai Watch 3 to a CIB of $375 as of June 2023. We stick with handheld platforms with our next entry, Atelier Annie, Alchemists of Serra Island, but before we check it out, a quick word from today's sponsor. This video is brought to you by Noob the Factionless. Based on the popular French web series Noob, here is a turn-based RPG experience with over 50 hours of gameplay and a myriad of challenges to overcome. Noob the Factionless sees you join a band of 4, Basta the Neogician, Drek the Berserker, May the Cartomancer and Logs the Elementalist, in their quest for the supreme level, to become legends of the MMORPG Horizon. Strengthen your team and upgrade your abilities by farming experience through your fights, adapt your skills to your fighting style or to the foes you encounter, customize your avatars with the best equipment you find in dungeons, grottos, chests and city shops, and use them to proceed ever deeper. But remember this, not all is as it seems in the virtual world. Challenges may exist not only in the world of Noob, but also in the real world as well. Who exists behind the avatar, and do their actions reflect as valorous or more sinister? You never know who sits behind the screen. Noob the Factionless is currently available digitally on the likes of Steam, Switch, Xbox One, Xbox Series, PS4 and PS5, but will also be getting a physical release on August the 29th for all modern platforms, so check the description to pre-order your copy today. And now, back to the video. Atelier Annie was one of 3 Atelier titles released for the Nintendo DS, but was the only one to be localized in North America, while Atelier Lys and Atelier Lena remained in Japan. It was also notable in that it was the first time North American audiences were introduced to the traditional gameplay of the series. Although the Irish trilogy and Manakemia had released on PS2 before for the region, Gust were looking to redefine the series into a more traditional RPG format with these releases, and needless to say, they did not perform all that well commercially. Atelier Annie went back to its roots and focused more on item creation and resource management, which has become a staple of the series going forward and sets it apart from contemporaries. That being said, the poor commercial reception of Iris and Manakemia would lead to a limited print run of Atelier Annie, as Gust clearly didn't hold confidence in the series' success translating outside of Japan. Compounding the issue further was the eventual demise of the DS as a platform, the lack of availability for digital versions following the delisting of titles on storefronts, and of course, in a twist of fate, the massive spike in popularity following the release of Atelier Riser. All these together have pushed Atelier Annie to a CIB of $139. Up next is the original Valkyrie profile for PlayStation 1. Lauded as one of the best RPGs on the platform, Valkyrie Profile found acclaim for its more somber ambience, excellent sound design, and eye-catching visuals. Playing as the Valkyrie Lennith, players journey through a land inspired by Norse mythology, collecting souls that will aid her come Ragnarok. And as the game progresses, Lennith begins to discover about her own life before she became a Valkyrie, ensuring that Valkyrie Profile would be one of the most memorable titles for RPG fans from the PS1 era. As was so often the case though around the 2000s, Japan didn't have much confidence in Western markets, and thus Valkyrie Profile's physical copies were limited at launch and only shipped to North America. This was in stark contrast to Japan, where it was a notable success, selling 636,000 units in the region alone by September 2005. For reference, worldwide sales by this point stood at just over 700,000. This did not dissuade Western fans who did pick it up though, and it quickly gained a following, not to mention a welcome port to the PSP with Valkyrie Profile Lennith. However, the original is still a sought after item with a current CIB of just over $300. Up next is Project .hack, specifically the fourth title, .hack Quarantine. Taking place in a fictional MMORPG called The World, it focuses initially on events known as the Twilight Incident, which result in players falling into a coma. That sounds familiar, right? That being said, .hack did come before Sword Art Online, with the former beginning production back in 1999 and eventually releasing in 2002 with the first title, Infection, coupled with the anime series beginning around this time too. Project .hack would see 3 more games release after this: Mutation, Outbreak, and Quarantine. And though the initial 3 titles do rise in price gradually as you delve deeper, they are still somewhat affordable. The final one in Quarantine, however, demands a current CIB of $270. This probably comes down to a simple factor: it's the last of a set. Project .hack was intended as a multimedia franchise spanning manga, trading cards, games, and anime. The anime in particular takes place before the events of the games, establishing the setting itself, which is then continued come the 4 PS2 titles. By the time players had got through the anime, the first 3 games, and maybe even some more media related to the series, they would inevitably want the final title. And naturally, as the series progresses, finding its direct sequels would likely become more challenging, as very few would wish to part with their complete collections. Up next is a more modern entry in Radiant's Historia Perfect Chronology. Admittedly not as expensive as others on this list, Perfect Chronology demands a current CIB of $83, though this shoots up to nearly $210 in PAL regions, with it rising considerably during lockdown. And it's quite simple to deduce why. The original Radiant Historia was considered one of the best RPGs on the DS, utilising time travelling as a core mechanic, with the main protagonist Stock able to travel between 2 separate lines to affect the other, all with the goal of discovering the true history. It was described as Atlus's most ambitious project for the platform and quickly won over many who were able to play it. So when the enhanced re-release came to the 3DS, it carried over that accolade and arguably became even more desirable. Following its positive reception, it's no wonder that it was the 3rd best-selling 3DS game in North America come early 2018. The rest, of course, is history. The 3DS itself is now a discontinued platform, the digital option is now no longer available following the delisting of titles, and it's highly sought after among JRPG fans, causing demand to remain high even today. We move now to the Sega Saturn with 1998's Panzer Dragoon Saga, and this brings back one of my earliest gaming related memories, for even though I never got to play Saga, I do remember playing the on-rail shooter Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei. I must have been about 4 years old. Praised for its more world-driven narrative with a notable soundtrack and atmosphere, Panzer Dragoon Saga found cult status for those who were able to play it, with current crowds comparing its ambience to the likes of Nier, and it's still highly sought after even today. The issue is its accessibility. It's still only available on the Sega Saturn, a console that only lasted 3 years in the West before it was replaced with the far superior Sega Dreamcast. So in other words, outside of emulation, it's very much a pipe dream for many. Then consider the low print run. While sources vary, it's generally accepted that around 1,000 units were produced for PAL regions. That is because the game came out at a time when the console was pretty much already in the dust, so it got very little in the way of a marketing drive. America did fare better, with far more copies being produced, anywhere between 10 to 30,000 units, but even that was not enough to sate demand. And that's even more egregious when, for its time, Panzer Dragoon Saga was considered one of the finest RPGs of the year, with publications praising its combat, visuals, and music. A fair few even considered it to be the best RPG on the Saturn, but that praise was not reflected in Japanese sales, as it only achieved around 110,000 units. This likely had the knock-on effect of lowering the confidence of Sega when they released it for Western audiences, leading to a lower supply run. The final nail in the coffin is that this game will likely never be ported elsewhere for one simple reason: Sega lost the source code. During the 90s, Sega were in the midst of a restructure to survive, and developer Team Andromeda were set aside. During this move, the source code of the game was lost, and chances are it will probably never be remade. As a result, Panzer Dragoon Saga is a game that is considered by some as one of the finest titles of the 90s, but is doomed to remain on a console that was arguably dead from the start. As a result, the game as of June 2023 now demands a CIB price of just over $1,000. The last game on this list will be from the often forgotten 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, simply abbreviated to 3DO, and it's for Lucian's Quest. Now, while it's worth noting that this RPG did also come to the Sega Saturn, that was only in Japan. The US only received it on the 3DO, and Europe never got it at all. Described as a more light-hearted adventure with a very simple premise, that being Lucian setting off with a lycanthrope named Argo to find a cure, Lucian's Quest wasn't too well received at the time, with critics stating that it did nothing to stand out against other RPGs of the time, but nowadays, opinion has somewhat swung in its favour. Though it is noted as simple with standard isometric turn-based gameplay, it's also acquired cult status in some ways like Panzer Dragoon Saga, but just like the former, it was subject to a similar fate in relation to its platform. The 3DO did not perform well. Its high price and an oversaturated market meant it was buried beneath cheaper and frankly better alternatives. This resulting poor commercial reception meant that the 3DO faded into obscurity, discontinuing in 1996, representing a life cycle of only 3 years. And because Lucian's Quest was only available to the West on this one platform, it became a highly sought after item in its own right. As of June 2023, it sits at a CIB of $660. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.